Okay, welcome. Today we are going to visit Mount Tabor, the scene of a very important battle back in Judges chapter 4 and 5, and also one of the probable locations for the Transfiguration of Christ, which we read about in Matthew chapter 17 and the parallel passages in Mark 9 and Luke 9. So we're going to pull up those slides and then we'll get you started on our journey to the Holy Land. Okay. Okay, here we are. First of all, we call this the Holy Land. As you can see, the Holy Land in the time of Jesus. Sometimes we refer to this as Israel and sometimes as Palestine, but today simply the Holy Land. That's actually a biblical phrase. It comes from Psalm 78, verse 59, where the psalmist says, God brought his people to the edge of his holy land. And so, very ancient way of referring to this land. Most of the geographical figures of the Holy Land tend to be kind of north to south. You know, the Jordan River with its valley, the great central highlands, the hill country. A few weeks ago we followed Abraham and Sarah as they came down the hill country. They stopped in Shechem and built an altar to the Lord, and then in Bethel, where they built an altar to the Lord, then down to Hebron, and then eventually over to Beersheba, right down that great central road. Right in the center of those highlands is the area of Bethel and Ramah, and a little bit later we'll be visiting with Deborah, who was a prophet who lived in Ramah. Ramah also happened to be the homeland of the prophet Samuel some years later. So the coastal plain also, a great coastal plain with the Via Maris, or the Way of the Sea, also north to south orientation comes up here. But then we get the change. The Via Maris breaks into this valley right here. And this valley, rather than running north to south, runs mostly east to west, although with a little bit of a slope to the south. Called in the Old Testament the Valley of Jezreel, and in the New Testament, Valley of Esdraelon. We're going to get a little bit closer now to see, close up to see that valley. Right here, that same valley. On this end of the valley is Mount Carmel, where Elijah, who we'll meet again on the Mount of Transfiguration, where Elijah had his great conflict with the prophets of Baal here on Mount Carmel, the western edge of the Esdraelon Valley. As you come down the valley, valley splits. You can see part of it goes this way, part of it goes down here towards Scythopolis. Nazareth right here where Jesus grew up. This is the Nazareth Ridge. From where Jesus grew up, you were kind of off the beaten path, but climb up the hill and you were looking at this great valley. On the northern fork of the valley brings us to Mount Tabor, which is where we will be this morning. A very beautiful valley, very broad and fertile. The breadbasket of Israel in the Old Testament times, New Testament times, and yet today. That's a view of the valley. This is east to west. We are on the north ridge of the valley. This is the Nazareth Ridge. The village of Nazareth is right behind me as I take this picture. And as you can see, the valley is very wide, very fertile, and also if you have chariots, it's ideal for warfare. And those mountains there mark the far edge of the valley. So we are here near Nazareth, looking east down the valley. Now we'll look a little farther east, and that is in fact Mount Tabor right there. Just kind of pops right up out of the valley, about 1,000 feet elevation from the valley floor to the top of the mountain. View of Mount Tabor from the other side, from the east side of the mountain. There's a small building that you can see right there at the top. We'll visit that a little bit later. But for now, we want to talk about Judges chapter 4 and 5. The time of Judges, the people were in difficult circumstances, as they were quite often. And then the Lord spoke to Deborah, who was a prophet, under her palm tree at Ramah, near Ramah and Bethel. And the Lord encouraged her, and she sent a message up to Barak, who's a military person up in this area. And she said, gather 10,000 warriors on Mount Tabor, and the Lord will help you. And he said, I am very, very, very fearful because Jabin, king of Hatzor, north of us, and his general Sisera have 900 chariots of iron, and as soon as we step off the hill into the valley, they will mow us down relentlessly. So I will not gather my men, and certainly not go down off the mountain unless you come with us. And she said, okay, I will come with you. She was a faithful prophet of the Lord. I will come with you, but then the honor for this will go to a woman, which it eventually did, Jael, who put Sisera out of commission a little bit later. Now, as you read Judges chapter 4 and Judges chapter 5, you recognize that what happened was, once the 10,000 Israelite warriors were gathered on Mount Tabor, and Sisera with his 900 iron chariots were in the valley, the Lord sent a phenomenal rainstorm, and the valley turned to mud. And suddenly, those war horses and those iron chariots, which had been an asset, suddenly became a liability as they were bogged down in the mud. And the scripture records in Judges 4 and 5 that Sisera eventually abandoned his chariot, ran on foot, wound up in the tent of Jael, and she dispatched him handily with a tent peg. So Tabor then became a very special mountain in Israelite memory as the launching point for this really great victory of Judges chapter 4 and Judges chapter 5. So just a little footnote here. If you happen to be a fan of English military history or French military history, you'll recognize this dynamic. It's the same dynamic that took place at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, where the French had heavy cavalry, heavy horses, heavy armor, and they were expected just to mow the English down, but the rainstorm changed everything, and the English won a victory. So sometimes these dynamics reoccur over time and over history. I'm sure the English were thinking about Judges 4 and 5 after the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. So this then, as I say, Judges chapter 4 and 5, very, very famous battle. Now, jumping to the New Testament, some of you have noticed that these videos are going back and forth from Old Testament to the New Testament. This one actually covers both, the Old Testament story of Deborah and then Barak and their great victory here at Mount Tabor. But now we also want to talk about the role of Mount Tabor in the New Testament. Matthew chapter 17, paralleled in Mark 9 and Luke 9, it says, Jesus took Peter, James, and John, he took them apart by themselves, away from the crowd, up a high mountain, and he was transfigured before their eyes. We are not told in Matthew 17 which mountain it was, but this is one of the possibilities. And in fact, there's a little building right there, which we're going to go visit right now. Very lovely church commemorating the Transfiguration, on the assumption that good likelihood that this was the mountain that was apart and high up. Some others have thought it might be Mount Hermon. That was the mountain of the Transfiguration. That is far, far north, a very northern edge of the Holy Land, in fact, slightly outside the Holy Land. So that would certainly qualify as being away or apart. It would certainly qualify as being high because it is so high that it actually is snow-covered most of the year. The problem with Mount Hermon is that Peter himself, who was of course here at the Transfiguration, Peter in 2 Peter 1 comments on the Transfiguration, and he says, we were with Jesus on the holy mountain. It takes a stretch to call Mount Hermon a holy mountain, because the southern face of Mount Hermon, which is the face toward the Holy Land, was well populated with shrines and temples to pagan Greek gods and pagan Roman emperors. I suppose you could stretch and say Christ's transfiguration made that mountain holy, but the way Peter says it strikes me as the transfiguration took place on a mountain that was already considered holy. And that really fits Mount Tabor because of the history there with Deborah and Barak and the Lord's great victory. Seemed very likely to me that Mount Tabor would have been considered a holy mountain. Also, we have Cyril of Jerusalem, Bishop of Jerusalem, about 350 AD, who identified Mount Tabor. He said, this is, we think, where the Transfiguration took place. In any case, it's where tradition has chosen to remember and to celebrate the Transfiguration. This very lovely church, designed by Antonio Barluzzi, who we've met before at the Beatitudes, completed in 1924. So it would be just really sweet to be there this year for their anniversary. 2 towers, one tower named Moses and one tower named Elijah, because of Moses and Elijah on the Mount of Transfiguration. So this is the place where traditionally we have remembered and commemorated the Transfiguration. Just to give you a sense of the glory of the mosaics inside this church, the peacocks are a symbol of resurrection in the early Christian iconography, because every year they shed their feathers and grow the new ones more beautiful and glorious than the previous ones. So they became a symbol of the resurrection very early in Christian iconography. The Domine bonum est nos hic esse, which is, Lord, it is good for us to be here. Of course, a quote from Matthew chapter 17, Peter to Jesus. And then in the great apse above the main part of the church, and he was transfigured before them. And just Jesus himself with Peter and James and John, and then with Moses and Elijah flanking him. He's talking with Moses and Elijah, then eventually the Moses and Elijah fade out, and the voice from heaven says, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." And Barluzzi, a genius architect that he is, designed this church and angled this church so that on the Feast of the Transfiguration, which is August 6th in the Roman Catholic calendar, the afternoon sun comes on and hits squarely on that gold leaf mosaic. You can imagine how glorious that is. Okay, a few more things about the Transfiguration. Some time ago, we visited St. Catherine's Monastery at Mount Sinai, at the foot of Mount Sinai. And we didn't spend much time inside the monastery grounds, but we're going to go inside the monastery grounds for just a moment here. This is the chapel where the monks do their daily prayer at St. Catherine's Monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai. And you'd expect it to be called the Chapel of the Burning Bush, or the Chapel of the Ten Commandments, or something like that. They call it the Chapel of the Transfiguration. And even when you know that and you go inside, you are shocked to find the artwork inside is not the burning bush, it's not Mount Sinai, it's not the Ten Commandments. It is, in fact, the Transfiguration. This is fresco, paint on plaster, paint on fresh plaster, with Elijah the prophet. Well, let's go first of all, Moses, who on the mountain brought the commandments down for the people. And then Elijah, who on Mount Carmel, called the people back to God. But the main focus on Christ, who is on the Mount of Transfiguration, on the Mount of Transfiguration in great glory, with John and Peter and James falling at his feet. And then when you move from this little chapel into the main sanctuary, you have a second mosaic of Christ at the Transfiguration. Again, now he's kindly given us their names. This is Elijah and Moses and John and Peter and James. So in both places there, the little side chapel and the main chapel, the focus is on the Transfiguration, which I find absolutely amazing. But I think the artist had perhaps some insight there, as artists sometimes do. I think the artist at Mount Sinai there, at the St. Catherine's Monastery, had some insight that the glory of the Lord in the burning bush, talking to Moses, pointed forward to the glory of the Lord on the mountain as he was giving the commandments to Moses. And that glory pointed forward to the Mount of Transfiguration, the one greater than Elijah and greater than Moses. And that glory on the Mount of Transfiguration, again, points forward to that time when he will return in glory, and every knee will bow, and every tongue confess that Jesus is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Thanks for joining us.